Hello everyone, now we are online indeed, and thank you very much for coming to this. It was a very wet Friday, not at all a June Friday, but now it's getting better actually here in London. So I'm Claudia Di Tosto, a PhD researcher at the University of Warwick in collaboration with the Paul Mellon Centre, and I'm also the convener of this symposium, which is the final part of a wider research project on exhibition histories called On Art Becoming Public, which started in September last year with the first event of the online reading group. So the idea behind On Art Becoming Public was to create a space for discussion and reflection about the role of exhibitions, what Lucy Steeds has called the becoming public of art, which is also the inspiration behind the title. So the role of exhibitions within the production of art history, and then more specifically British art history. And the sort of guiding principle of the project was this semiotic notion of the exhibition as an act of communication, which it's a notion that drew from the writing of the Italian philosopher and writer Umberto Eco, and it's a notion that aims to explore the exhibition as a medium to be analyzed in both its denotative aspects, what it does, and connotative aspects, what it means. For my own PhD research, which focuses on the history of the British Pavilion, thank you, Femi, which focuses on the history of the British Pavilion at the Venice Art Biennale from 1948 to 2022, I had been reading a lot of more or less recent scholarship around exhibition histories. And I thought it would be interesting and hopefully also useful for other researchers or simply anyone that was interested in the topic to explore and discuss together some of these texts. So this is how the reading group, which happened again between September 2024 and March 2025, came about. And for me it was also important that the group could meet online, so that people could join regardless of where they were, and which is also, of course, the reason why today's symposium is being live streamed. And the reading group comprised of 4 events, each revolved around different approaches to exhibition histories. And I do think that there are quite a few among the people attending today that have joined the reading group online at a certain point, but I'm just going to very, very briefly summarize some of the things that we spoke online about. So the first event focused on how practice-led research can contribute to disrupt established narratives around seminal exhibitions such as Documenta 11, which was held in 2002. And I invited Sunil Shah, who is a PhD researcher at the UAL, to speak about his research, which does indeed focus on this. Then there was the second event of the reading group, which was focused on interpretative written walking tour of an exhibition. For the third event, we explored an aspect of exhibitions which usually goes unnoticed and undocumented, which is exhibition design history. And in that case, our speaker was Azra Williams, who used specifically the interview as a core methodology to explore exhibition design. The fourth and final event in the reading group focused instead on examining the quite intimate and personal letters written by the artist Lubaina Hamid, who you might know is also going to be the next representative of Britain at the Biennale in 2026. So, if you already had a look at the program of the symposium, maybe you will have noticed that there are quite a few themes from the reading group that will return or intersect with what we are going to speak about today. And indeed, the idea behind having a symposium as part of the project was to both expand on some of the discussion that started during the reading group, but also to introduce themes that had to be cut from the online program because of time. But that I was very, very keen to examine a little bit closer, inviting people that have been working on these themes for quite some time now. And I'm very, very proud and happy to have this lineup of speakers and chairs today. Some of them I knew before, others we met through this, but I'm really looking forward to hear from all of them. So today is going to be articulated in panels, which are centered around 4 topics: installation views as both documentation and visual objects, queer exhibition histories, regional exhibition histories, and the intersection between British art history and filmmaking, which is also explored through the film commission by Juliet Jacques. Each panel will be articulated around a conversation between a chair and 2 panelists, or a chair and 1 panelist, as in the case of queering exhibition histories, as unfortunately Fiona Anderson could not join us today. After each panelist presentation, a Q&A will follow, including, of course, a question from the audience, so please feel free to raise your hand during the Q&A. And so I won't read the bios of our speakers, as the chairs will do it later, but allow me, though, to briefly introduce our wonderful chairs. So for the first panel, on queering exhibition histories, we have Ben Cranfield, who is Associate Dean for the School of Arts and Humanities at the Royal College of Art here in London. For the Centering Exhibition Histories, Jennifer Powell, who is Director of the Barber Institute of Fine Arts in Birmingham. For the Moving Exhibition, Lynda Nead, who is Visiting Professor of History of Art at the Courtauld here in London again. And for documenting the exhibition and the exhibition as document, we have Jonathan Watts, who is PhD candidate at Norwich University of the Arts. Before we get to the panels, though, as you will know from the program, we are going to screen for the first time ever a short survey of English surrealism, which focuses on the International Surrealism Exhibition held at the New Burlington Galleries in London in 1936. A short survey of English surrealism is a new film by the writer and filmmaker Juliet Jacques, which was commissioned as part of On Art Becoming Public. So I was very keen on having this film commission as part of this project because I'm a strong supporter of the potential of filmmaking for academic research in general, but even more so for fields such as art history, where our subject is about the visual, and exhibition studies, where we really research something where the kinetic aspect, as Richard Hamilton would say, so this fact that you can move around a space is crucial. So I do think that filmmaking can really merge the visual, the kinetic in ways that writing cannot. And the Paul Mellon Centre as well has been developing projects around the intersection between British art history and filmmaking, with initiatives such as British Art in Motion, which is a filmmaking competition for undergrad students, and also the film commissions for the lecture series British Blonde, which was conceived by one of our chairs, Lynda Nead. So I was working on Art Becoming Public. I was thinking about this film commission. Then I went for a few days in Athens. And I know that it sounds like a leap, but there is a sense in this story I'm telling. So I was in Athens. I went to the National Museum of Contemporary Art there. And there was an exhibition called Modern Love, or Love in the Age of Cold Intimacies, which is an amazing title, by the way. And there I saw a short film that Juliet had done at Studio Voltaire, for Studio Voltaire. And I had known Juliet only as a writer at the time. I knew that Juliet was someone who writes a lot about art and culture, among other things. I didn't know that she was a filmmaker yet, but I just thought that it would be amazing if she would be willing to be involved. So I got in touch, and luckily she said yes, obviously, because the film is here. And so we are going to move on to the screening now, and after myself and Juliet will tell you a bit more about the making of the film. But before I finally stop speaking, let me just read you Juliet's bio. So, Juliet Jacques was born in Red Hill, Surrey, in 1981. She has published 6 books, including Trans, a memoir, in 2015, 2 short story collections, including Variation in 2021, Frontlines, Transjournalism 2007-2022, that was published in 2022, yes, and a novella, Monaco, published in 2023. Her fiction, journalism, and essays have appeared in The Guardian, including her Transgender Journey column, longlisted for the Orwell Prize in 2011. Juliet's writing has also been on the New York Times, Frieze, London Review of Books, and many other publications. Her short films have screened in galleries and festivals across the world. She teaches at the Royal College of Art and elsewhere. She also hosted the arts discussion program Suite on Resonance 104.4 FM and is a co-host of the Pro Revolution Soccer. She has played football for Clapton Community FC, Horley Town, and Surrey. Very important. This is why I'm reading it. It's the important bit. So I'm going to start the film. Let's see what happens now. And also, sorry, just as a warning, the captions are pulled from YouTube. This is why they're not going to be perfect.
No, they're mostly very good. They just struggle a bit with the proper names. So.
I'm going to repeat for those online. So the captions are good. It's just the names that are going to get a little bit tricky. But here you go. Let's see.
The surrealist object. This is the surrealist object speaking to the British public.
The International Surrealist Exhibition at the New Burlington Galleries in London in June 1936 was supposed to launch an English surrealist movement, 12 years after André Breton published the first Surrealist Manifesto. Drawing on the French group's radical politics, the main English theorist, Herbert Reed, set out to oppose the self-complacency, ever-elastic sectarianism and rampant capitalistic oppression of British society through surrealist art and writing. But England's biggest advocate of the movement, young poet David Gascoigne, worried that there will be many to protest that surrealism is foreign to the national temperament, that it cannot grow here as it has no roots in English tradition. Reed and Gascoigne aimed to prove the doubters wrong, and the signs that surrealism might take root in England were encouraging. British artists from Edward Burrough to Henry Moore agreed to take part, alongside some of the biggest names in the European group. It got off to a bad start. Salvador Dali went to see Gorman and Co. to buy a diving suit. When asked how deep he intended to go in it, Dali said that he would dive into the human subconscious. Holding a dagger, a billiard cue and 2 dogs on leads, he gave a lecture in it, but the helmet started suffocating him. Gascoigne had to prise it off him with a spanner. Despite considerable media interest, we only have a few photographs. The English surrealists did not share the French group's interest in cinema and did not even film the opening. So there's no footage of Dylan Thomas offering teacups full of boiled string, asking, weak or strong? No footage of Dali nearly drowning without water, and no footage of artist Sheila Legge as the Phantom of Surrealism, in a costume inspired by Dali, feeding pigeons in Trafalgar Square to promote the exhibition at Gascoigne's request. This was the only performance I dared to replicate, but I couldn't be entirely historically accurate.
What is a surrealist object? It is an idea. What a good idea, people say, when something occurs to them, when something appeals to their imagination. How do such ideas come? It is often hard to say. Suddenly or gradually, they are part of our consciousness. Awake or asleep, we become aware of them. Where then do they come from? Some people say, confidently, out of the unconscious. Others will tell you, from the world of dreams. Others, again, speak only of poetry. We need not go into that.
Aged just 20, Gascoigne had established himself as the English movement's most prominent writer, publishing a short survey of surrealism and a volume of poems called Man's Life Is This Meat, collecting his surrealist verse and his translations of some of the French group. He also wrote the first English manifesto of surrealism, in French. Gascoigne and artist Roland Penrose planned the exhibition not in London, but in Paris. At this point, you have to wonder whether they wanted an English surrealism, or if what they really wanted was just to be French. I know the feeling. Their francophilia was not reciprocated. Famously, André Breton refused to learn English even when he moved to the United States, and the Surrealist Map of the World, drafted in 1929, reduces the United Kingdom to a tiny speck. Nonetheless, Breton was supportive, and Gascoigne and Penrose persuaded a handful of other English critics and writers to help organise it. Critics Hugh Sykes-Davis and Herbert Reed, poets Humphrey Jennings and Roger Wroughton, and possibly Sheila Legge. In this, they hoped to will a domestic movement into being, asking artists who they thought might fit the bill to participate. Eileen Agar, for one, was surprised. One day I was an artist exploring highly personal combinations of form and content, she wrote in her autobiography. The next day I was a surrealist. Nonetheless, Agar participated, along with the likes of John Banting, Graham Sutherland and Julian Trevelyan. Max Ernst designed the poster, and the exhibition included nearly 400 paintings, sculptures and objects from 68 artists. Hours before the opening, artist, writer and gallery owner E.L.T. Meesons arrived. He found the hanging hopelessly unimaginative. It had missed the point of surrealism, he said, which was to make unexpected juxtapositions, like Lautréamont's famous chance meeting on a dissecting table of a sewing machine and an umbrella. Reed asked visitors to judge the hastily reordered exhibition by its imaginative scope, its intimate revelations, its surprising incoherence, its super-reality. Whether or not they did so is unrecorded, but 23,000 people attended its 3-week run, and coverage was positive, although The Guardian, for one, did not mention a single English artist in their review. Nonetheless, an English surrealist group was formed in response to the exhibition, taking part in shows in Paris, New York and Tokyo. Meesons, a Belgian, soon took control of it, but there was a crisis in early 1940 when he expelled Reed and several others because they would not swear fealty to the surrealist group, nor to the proletarian revolution. Despite his reluctance to commit to the radical left, Reed borrowed Marxist language in his writings about surrealism, lamenting that artists had only interpreted the world in different ways, when the point was to transform it. But the English artists and writers never came close to the radicalism of the French, partly because Davis and Charles Madge argued that a domestic surrealism should evolve from British literary traditions, from William Blake to Wyndham Lewis, who declared his hatred for surrealism via Lewis Carroll and Edward Lear. Davis also used Marxist terms, calling surrealism a natural and inevitable product of historical forces. For the French, radical politics were integral to surrealism. For the English, political commitment took them away from it. Davis, a critic and novelist, turned back to his other literary interest and towards politics, nearly standing to become a Labour MP before they found out that he was also a member of the Communist Party. Gascoigne went to Spain to support the anti-fascist cause, left in disgust at the behaviour of the Stalinists, and then turned towards more mystical and metaphysical forms of poetry. He also became involved with mass observation, recorded by Humphrey Jennings and Charles Madge to record everyday life. Retaining the radical spirit of surrealism in their exhaustive detailing of the seemingly mundane, they intended to subvert government and media attempts to control the public mood. Once the Second World War broke out, Jennings' priorities changed. He put his filmmaking abilities to the cause, making documentaries that were patriotic and archetypally British. Rawton didn't see out the war. Aghast at the Nazi-Soviet pact, and possibly struggling with his sexuality, he gassed himself in Ireland in 1941. Measons ran the London Gallery from 1938, initially with Roland Penrose, making it the home of the English Surrealists. He tried to hire Sheila Legg as their secretary, but she moved to Cornwall and died in 1949. Measons closed the gallery in 1951, marking an end to the group, which had split after he fell out with another immigrant leader, Tony Del Renzio, a descendant of the House of Romanov, who had fought with the Trotskyists in Spain. Penrose remained a surrealist but left the group, joining Herbert Reed to form the Institute of Contemporary Art in the heart of London, 10 minutes from the New Burlington galleries. The ICA is perhaps English surrealism's greatest legacy, given how little impact the group's work made on literature or visual arts during its brief existence. Art historian Michel Remy wrote about the lack of sustained interest in collective work or in the defence of common values, inherent in the British individualistic diffidence towards ideologies and the formation of close-knit groups. Perhaps this, as much as the coming of war, explains the group's failure to remain coherent. Was it a lack of censorship or Catholicism, or being colonial rulers rather than subjects, that gave the English too little to push against? Or was it that Davis was right? A certain type of surrealism was already embedded in English literature, making it harder to present it as a revolutionary force and trapping the English into a domestic traditionalism. It was left to sketch shows, from Monty Python to Chris Morris, to represent the surreal in subsequent English culture, and it's there that you can best imagine an exasperated shop assistant selling a deep-sea diving suit to Salvador Dali.
Food Brain, Walter Franco, Friend Sound, Fred Frith, Dash, 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 Dash.
Mula, God in Disguise, Gomorrah, Gone, Greaves and Blackbad, Fernando Grillo, Grobschnitt, Group 1850, Jean Gahan, Friedrich Gulda.
Femi, this is what I was supposed to do, right? Yes. Thank you. Okay. So, Juliet, if you want to join me, we can sit over there and we can have our chat. All right. So we need to speak in microphones because if not, Femi is going to get very hungry. Angry, right, Femi? Yes.
If they're in front of me, I do tend to pick them up.
So, Juliet, thank you so much, first of all, for being here.
Pleasure.
And I thought that we could start in talking about a bit about why you were interested in examining this exhibition in particular.
Yeah, there's lots of reasons, really. I actually attempted to do a PhD on the English Surrealist group 20 years ago. Ended up not doing it and doing a different PhD 10 years ago. But I've always been interested in surrealism. I've always liked surrealism. And yeah, it's the European and the French and sort of Belgian and Spanish surrealists where I started. So, as a student, doing all the things you should be doing, like watching Untitled and checking out René Magritte and, reading André Breton and Louis Aragon and Artaud and all the rest of it. And, unfortunately, I'm British, as you saw in the photograph. So, just by default, really, I have quite a lot of interest in British art and culture. And, my tastes are quite modernist in literature, in film, in art, kind of everywhere, really, architecture. And, these sort of radical movements, they've never been something that the British were very good at. Where there are sort of more interesting British avant-garde movements, it tends to feel like they're happening in the slipstream of somewhere else. The vorticists would furiously deny it, but they're very clearly influenced by the Italian futurists, for example. And sort of what interested me about the British surrealist movement was, how conscious an attempt it was to import this, this aesthetic and its politics. And, when you came to me with the commission and saying you wanted me to, look at a specific exhibition or sort of exhibition history, I thought back to all the research I'd done on the way this international surrealist exhibition at the New Burlington Galleries was trying to, as I put it in the film, like will a domestic surrealism into being. And, the way they incorporated all these artists, that quote from Eileen Agar is wonderful, where she's basically just saying, well, I didn't really think I was a surrealist, but all right, fine, let's try it. And the film, I think, gets to some of the reasons why the movement didn't really work, in part because a lot of the people who were its sort of chief advocates in 1936 were quite dilettantish about it. George Orwell said of Herbert Reed, like, the problem with Herbert Reed is that he likes everything. And so, he's sort of interested in surrealism and expressionism and futurism and cubism and, all these, if you are, like Herbert Reed was, a kind of all-encompassing critic of modern art, then you would be interested in and probably like all of these things. But, if you're going to make a kind of success of a sort of, modern or avant-garde art movement, you do need to sort of pick some sort of aesthetic principles and really commit to them, I think. And none of the British people involved with this exhibition really came close to doing that with surrealism, at least not for more than a couple of years.
And I'm just thinking that even looking at the exhibition landscape today, I think that there has been quite a revival of interest for British surrealism. I'm thinking about also the Ital Colquhoun exhibition. I think that is now at Tate and Ives. In general, a revival of interest in surrealism after the 2022 Venice Biennale. So that has been quite interesting to see. And and also I forgot to say that, of course, if there are questions from the audience, we are also taking those. I was also wondering if you could tell us a little bit more, Juliet, about the making of the film. Of course, we spoke about how difficult it is to source visual material, especially when you work on historical exhibitions. You didn't have the filming, of course, the filming sequence of the opening, while I would say that now we have maybe too much documentation on exhibitions. But I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I found that very interesting, and it speaks to another of my big frustrations with British modernism more generally, is their lack of interest in film in general. Virginia Woolf wrote, I think, a 4-page essay on film, and that's the only time she really talks about it, and that's about seeing a kind of speck of dirt on a projection of Dr. Caligari. Wyndham Lewis said he hated film for some reason, I can't remember why. He hated a lot of things. The French surrealists, as I say, sort of Germaine Dulac working with Artaud and people proximate to the surrealist movement, like kind of Marcel Duchamp and, of course, Man Ray, directing films. And that just didn't happen in Britain. And, the fact that they got Salvador Dali over, went and bought him a deep sea diving suit, got him a load of dogs, got him to do a speech, and I just thought, no, there's no need to film this. Is baffling to me. It's absolutely inexplicable that they would not document that.
I agree.
So I sort of built that frustration into the film because I suspected there wasn't any film because when I looked into this 20 years ago, I hadn't found anything. And I thought if there was film of this stuff, surely I would have heard of it or seen it. So you helped me research this and you couldn't find anything. There's some indication that they might have filmed it like privately, but there's no confirmation of that, and if they did, it's not surfaced. So really my sort of frustration at the lack of filming anything, and again the Sheila Legg performance, like why on earth did they not think to film that? So, you know, I mean that did at least give me this sort of fun opportunity to recreate it, which was like probably the most fun thing to do with the filmmaking. Because one of the things I'd forgotten about archive filmmaking, it's like 8 years since the film I made, You'll Be Free, that you referenced, which is almost entirely archive. Most of it's just admin. There's like the fun bit where you're researching and you're finding the footage that you want, and you see, so you think, oh, that's great, I want that, and then it's just like, further to my email of 3 weeks ago. But yeah, I mean, so, you know, obviously there's quite a lot of archive footage in the film, but it's not surrealist stuff. It's, I mean, what do you see? You see Cecil Hepworth and Percy Stowe's film of Alice in Wonderland from 1903, and that sort of merges into Workers' Newsreel number 2 from 1934, which is where all the kind of like trade unionist and communist and anti-fascist footage comes from. And, you know, there's these lovely little moments with that. I mean, you mentioned in the bio that I was born in a town called Red Hill in Surrey, and it's very much blink and you'll miss it. But you do see a flag for the Red Hill Communist Party, which was no longer there when I was growing up. Otherwise, I might have got involved. But so there's these little joys like that, and then lots of just writing to people being like, yeah, can you reply to my email? The images are largely from the National Gallery of Scotland, which is where they ended up becoming the kind of keepers of the exhibition archive, which I was, you know, slightly surprised about. I mean, the group did call themselves the English Surrealist Group and not the British Surrealist Group, which I always thought was strange. And so the archive of the English Surrealist movement has wound up in Scotland, which, fine, I guess. They were very helpful, and they had a lot of very good quality digitised images. So they have taken real care of what legacy there is of the exhibition. I mean, you know, I tried to get some archive images from, you know, bigger institutions. And the cost of licensing them was just prohibitive. I mean, you know, like one gallery, I wanted an image of a Roland Penrose work. And I said, well, it's going to flash on screen very briefly for a film that's being made in a fairly low budget for an academic context. And they were like, yeah, that will be like £100 plus VAT for a one-off screening. And I was like, right, well, if I do that, I can't show the film ever again. And that's a huge problem with licensing anything. So all the works that you see in the film, whether they're photos or moving images, you know, I've got a license to just show them in perpetuity, which is the only way you can do this, really.
Yeah. I think it's very important to speak about this because this is how, when you, as a young, or I mean, at the early stage of your career, PhD researcher, you start thinking about publishing and you don't know that actually you have to pay for images and all this kind of stuff. So it's very important to speak about this. And also,
different places have different policies. And, you know, I interviewed an American filmmaker yesterday who's made a film about the encampments in Columbia University. And there's loads of like news footage from sort of Fox and CNN. And I was like, what was the process like? And he was like, it's all just fair use. So, for example, in the States, it's much more amenable to this type of filmmaking. There's an interesting link as well to the present. You see Humphrey Jennings in the film, both standing next to Andre Breton and a clip from his film London Can Take It. It was one of his like war films. His cameraman was Adam Curtis's, I think, father, maybe grandfather. But so there's a nice link to sort of present day like archive filmmaking. And there's, you know, Adam Curtis is someone who big influence on me as an archive filmmaker. So,
Also, I would say shout out to all the archivists that do help us, because they are the skeleton of each academic research, I would say. And I just wanted to check if there is any question from the public. Lily.
Thank you. Congratulations on the film. It was really interesting. I love the bits, as you obviously did, where you perform the kind of, you reenact the surrealist action. And I wondered, were you not tempted to do more of those? I would have liked to see more.
The only other one that I had documentation of was Dali nearly killing himself, which, I didn't really fancy. I mean, actually, it might have been fun to just go to a shop dressed as Salvador Dali and be like, I need a diving suit to dive into the human subconscious. That could have been fun, actually. But yeah, the leg action is the only thing, apart from Dylan Thomas offering people cups of boiled tea. The leg action just seemed like the most plausible one to recreate, and it was really good fun. We were a bit worried about filming at Trafalgar Square because you're supposed to pay them £1,000, but I think that's if they close down the square for you. And there were lots of people around when I was doing it, and I think there was bloody art students. I think
you can tell a whole group of students.
Exactly,
behind
yeah. No, those kids were fun as well. They were sort of asking questions and just pointing and stuff. Yeah, I mean, it would be fun to do more surrealist actions, or maybe come up with my own. I mean, maybe that's the next film.
That would be amazing, actually.
Just to say, the reactions of people in that scene that you just mentioned are also interesting when we're considering the reactions to the surrealist exhibition, I suppose. So, what normal people have thought seeing these artists.
Yeah,
so
I mean,
cool to have
in 1936, it probably made more of an impact because, performance art wasn't really a thing at that point, and like I said, I think a lot of people are just used to people doing weird things in Trafalgar Square, and also just people filming stuff all the time. I mean, I had Rufai, who was a cinematographer, just obviously tracking me with a camera. And like I said, they just for some reason didn't bother doing that in 1936. But, seeing somebody film someone doing something weird is a lot less of a shock to the public in 2025 than it would have been in 1936. So, yeah.
Thanks so much. That was it was really refreshing to see, and I suppose this is what I want to sort of ask you to talk on, the kind of mood and kind of affect of revisitation that you're kind of enacting in the film. And I suppose I was thinking of that as really running counter to the kinds of revisitation of the British surrealists that I think we've seen, are very prevalent at present, that seem are so reverent and in many ways are sort of doing what you're kind of... I love this idea of the sort of willing kind of British surrealism into being, and I think in a way many of these sort of very reverent kind of revisitations that are happening at present are sort of attempting to do the same, possibly in a way that feels quite kind of historical. And I just wondered if I could kind of ask you to sort of speak a bit to maybe to the sort of mood and affect, and if there is a kind of countering that you see there to what's sort of happening at present.
Yeah, I mean, I've been very interested in the fact that there, as Claudia said, there has been a revival of interest in surrealism more generally, British surrealism in particular, and also in, sort of revisiting the place of women in surrealism, because the French founders, Breton in particular, were notorious misogynists and homophobes. And there were interesting women associated with surrealism, and in Britain that was more a case of interesting women doing work that, as Eileen Agar says, could be roped into it, but they weren't really largely thinking of themselves as surrealists. And yeah, there is this line about Lewis Carroll, and actually I didn't include it in the film, but André Breton said the British have no need for surrealism because they've got Lewis Carroll. And you read the writing of someone like Leonora Carrington in particular, who did the overwhelming majority of her life and work was in Mexico, and she was just as much, if not more, engaged with Mexico as with Britain, although Britain is where her roots were. But you couldn't have Leonora Carrington's writing without Lewis Carroll, but you probably could have it without, you know, Breton's Nadia or Aragon's Paris Peasant or whatever. So, you know, really sort of actually trying to think about the way that most of the people in Britain who either called themselves Surrealists or were called Surrealist were thinking of themselves just as much, if not more, in this tradition of kind of nonsense poetry, fantastical children's literature, you know, as well as sort of having one eye on what was happening in the Surrealist movement. I mean, in terms of the mood and the affect of the film, you know, as well as sort of looking back into those sort of divergent influences on what gets called British Surrealism, you know, I was interested in the fact that, yeah, like the sort of most tangible legacy of an idea of Surrealism is probably in like British comedy, you know, like Monty Python, you know, particularly through Terry Gilliam's animations. You know, it does feel like there's a kind of engagement with the idea of the surreal, or some of Chris Morris's work, like kind of Jam. I mean, you can really imagine Salvador Dali buying a diving suit, you know, as a sort of Monty Python or a Jam sketch, you know, more than you can imagine it as something that most other British artists would be interested in doing. So yeah, kind of wanting to bring in the fact that this stuff was quite kind of playful and quite dilettantish, as I sort of said earlier, and, you know, me recreating that Sheila Legg performance, it's a very kind of dilettantish act, you know. I don't normally do stuff like that. So yeah, so trying to capture that sort of, you know, for good or bad. I'll sort of leave the audience to judge that, I think. But yeah, trying to bring those sorts of moods and affects into the film.
Yep.
I've got my own question, and also just to remind people online, they can submit questions. They will be sent into the room, and I can read them out as well.
Thank you, Sarah.
So we want to make sure everyone feels really included in the room and online. Just following on from that really interesting discussion and about the kind of links between the Victorians and Surrealism, and I was thinking about that in terms of the exhibition histories and display, and in the film you mentioned, you know, this sort of disappointment that the exhibition is actually quite traditional, or it maybe traditions, well, or it draws on a kind of form of display that's very well known and developed at places like the Royal Academy and the salon hang. And I was just thinking maybe that's a theme that will run through today, that actually the exhibition form of putting things on a wall and maybe on the floor or a plinth, you know, it actually, it's a kind of quite set piece, or you see a kind of lineage, trajectory, histories through it, and actually to disrupt that is pretty difficult. Yeah. And then it's interesting to see performance and photography and movement doing something different, but the whole thing of exhibition making in a room is actually quite contained. Yeah. So I was kind of interested to think about that, and then that Victorian 19th century, you know, they're just such strong connections there.
Yeah, and, you know, most of these people were very classically educated and, you know, from fairly privileged backgrounds. I'm not so sure about David Gascoigne, who, does kind of get involved with Surrealism from the age of about 16. But, you know, you heard the voice of Herbert Reed, and he was, like, by some distance, the least posh one. And he's just like, what a good idea. You know, Hugh Sykes-Davis, background at, I think, Oxford, Cambridge, and a lot of them came through Cambridge, actually, and the sort of, you know, poetry journals like Charles Madge and people like that. So they're very, very kind of, you know, trying to break with a real, you know, inherited traditionalism and conservatism in their own thinking, I think. And, you know, you do feel like the English surrealist movement as a, you know, exhibition-making practice, it is kind of doomed from the start when E.L.T. Meesons, who is Belgian, like, you know, turns up from Belgium, takes one look at the exhibition and goes, oh no, you've got this all wrong, you don't know what you're doing. And, you know, just makes them, like, rehang it. Which they did, like, the day before, you know, hours before the exhibition. They, you know, just had to rehang the whole thing because, you know, the European, you know, continental European people who actually kind of were surrealists, like, turned up and was like, no, this is all wrong. So yeah, that's really interesting, and yeah, how they sort of struggled to break with that. Absolutely.
A question online. I'm not sure whether you or anyone will know about this theme, but someone's asking if there's any research into neurodiversity, surrealism.
That's a really interesting question, and yeah, it's not one I know about, actually. I mean, I've sort of focused very specifically on this movement and this exhibition, so yeah.
No, but very interesting question, actually. Yeah. Ella. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you for that film. It was both fascinating and funny, and it was making me think about maybe the dry sense of English humour, which maybe could explain some of the French reticence. Yeah. But my question actually is about the idea of containment as well, of exhibitions, because it reminded me of an exhibition in 1959 that was staged by the Arts Council collection. And the second of these exhibitions explored the French influence on British art. Right. So it was trying to give this very contained story of British art history in the 20th century. And interestingly, Herbert Reed was on the purchasing committee for the Arts Council collection, so there's quite a big representation of British surrealists there. I was wondering, are there any other public collections in Britain which also contain a lot of these British surrealist works?
Yeah, good question. I mean, there is the Roland Penrose and Lee Miller archive, which is based partly at like Farley Farm in Sussex, where they lived, and obviously the collection at the National Gallery of Scotland. Otherwise, yeah, like, you know, the work that got put under this English and British Surrealist banner is quite disparate. I mean, the Tate do have a fair bit of it. But yeah, you know, with the exception of the archive at the National Gallery of Scotland, which is, you know, much more sort of press clippings, photography, posters, you know, the actual works have not been put together as kind of surrealist works anywhere else, really, as far as I'm aware. You know, you compare it to one of the first kind of art collection or exhibition stories I really remember hitting the news was in 2003 when I was like 21, and André Breton had this massive collection of objects that, you know, he just accumulated over his lifetime that he felt in themselves like constituted surrealist artwork as long as they were all kept together. And they were broken up, and in the end, like, the Pompidou Centre has a sort of cross-section of them, but they weren't all kept together, and you know, there was never any thinking about this stuff like that in Britain, really. Does that answer your question? I feel like I
I just also want to note as well, there was a British surrealist called Ruth Adams. I don't know if you came across her name. Ruth Adams.
Ruth Adams.
Yeah, so she was part of the group, and she was kind of excluded because apparently she was expendable to the movement. But she's got some works at the Lane Art Gallery, which might be quite interesting to explore.
Right, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thing about sort of surrealism, whether it's people, you know, capital S or small s, there's so much of it. You're always finding really interesting people doing something with it. And I travel around England in particular a lot, and spend a lot of time just going to like kind of quote unquote provincial art galleries, and you know, always finding like interesting artists from the 20th century. And yeah, they're more often than not women rather than men. And you can go to like the art gallery in Derby, for example, which, you know, is very, very proud of its collection of works by Joseph Wright of Derby. But, you know, there are also some really interesting like surrealist works from the 1940s by like female artists. So yeah, there's always more to discover.
Thank you.
There is another question online? Yeah.
Oh, no, I don't think
a few
so.
questions in the room as well.
At the back, and I think that's going to be the last question, though, because
We're running out of time.
we are running a little bit out of time, yes.
I'll be very quick, but I just want to follow up on what you mentioned about André Breton's collection, because it just made me remember this film called The Trick Brain by Ed Atkins, which I haven't seen his survey show yet, so I'm not sure if it's in that, but that is a film of that apartment, of Breton's apartment, which and the footage was made by wasn't taken by Ed Atkins, but made by another filmmaker for the auctioning for the auction of the works, and so the footage itself comes from a CD-ROM that was used for the auctioning of that work.
Great lost format, CD-ROM.
Just really quickly, when I was doing some research for the Paul Nash exhibition at Tate, I found 2 strips of 35mm film of the Surrealist exhibition.
No way.
Wow.
So yeah, I just was looking through my phone to find the photo, so I'll share it with you.
Right, yes, send them my way. I'm going to have to remake the film.
Actually, yes. So if you can let us know, yes, please.
How long are they? I mean, have you seen them?
No, it's tiny. They're like 5 frames, and it's really weird because they're not. So it must have been.
So they're like
frames taken from it, but they're non-sequential.
Right.
But then it's still credited to Gaumont British. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll show you.
Interesting. Yeah, I did hear when I was sort of liaising with the National Gallery of Scotland, they suggested something similar. But yeah, there's no like surviving kind of proper public film. I mean, it's incredible that like British Pathé didn't just turn up, but like strange scenes at the New Burlington Galleries in London, where the great European artist Salvador Dali gave an interesting speech, and then it's kind of remarkable that they didn't think to get those guys along. I mean, the same year like they fell out with the Football Association, right, British Pathé. And so they like sent a Zeppelin to like film the FA Cup final from like a mile above the stadium or something, but they didn't go along to the New Burlington Galleries to film this like landmark surrealist exhibition. They just, if you watch the Pathé report from the 1936 FA Cup final, it's like one of the best British surrealist films ever made, actually. It's really weird. There's like all these animations and stuff because they're not allowed to show any of the footage. It's incredible.
Is it a quick question? Yes.
Yeah, don't let me end by talking about the cup.
Brilliant. I'm just going to voice what everyone's probably thinking, which is this is a huge shame, and it just opens up a huge void. And I wondered if you were tempted to look outside the clique of the Cambridge graduates and think what working class people, experimentalists, were making films, maybe even public service announcements at the time, as we have in Iran. We found out that so many people were surrealists without even knowing it. Yeah. Were you ever tempted to sort of be that person?
I mean, if I'd done the PhD on this, I probably would have been, because there would be that level of undertaking, I think. I mean, the surrealists themselves, I talk about mass observation briefly in the film, and the way that, Jennings and Charles Madge, it's a surrealist background to this sort of anthropological, process of like asking people from all backgrounds of society, what they thought about anything really in this like very, very granular detail. Like in terms of chronicling a sort of like working class
because there was that group in Birmingham who were opposed, and I'm sure people just didn't know at the time that they were surrealists. And they didn't have emails, they didn't have, they only had the newspaper. So
yeah, and this stuff wasn't getting coverage, so why were they, how were they finding out about it? Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And again, I think you can not just find these sort of artists from well outside of these cliques who were doing work that was either like consciously or less consciously surrealist, but you can find it all the way through sort of British culture, throughout the 20th century. And I mean, at the end, the closing music is by Nurse with Wound, like Steve Stapleton. And what I love about kind of punk and post-punk is this incredible like popular modernism that happens in the 1970s and through sort of the cultural democracy movement of the 40s, 50s, 60s. You get a real opening up of the BBC, arts institutions, art schools, to people from like working class and lower middle class backgrounds. And surrealism is utterly prevalent through all this stuff. Like I said, whether it's comedy from Monty Python to like Simon Munnery to the sort of group around Chris Morris or Frank Sidebottom or whatever. Whether it's like bands like Nurse with Wound. There are lots of interesting places in which surrealism like surfaces, and it took time, I think. But yeah, certainly from the sort of mid-30s onwards, there are all sorts of interesting places you can find this. And it's something the film kind of posits that maybe this surrealist exhibition wasn't the most interesting place to find British surrealist art. And indeed, The Guardian just turned up and like, there's loads of great works here, Magritte, Dali, Picasso, all your favourites. And, it didn't occur to them clearly to mention, any of the like UK artists who are exhibiting. So yeah.
I'm really sorry to stop the fun, but unfortunately I have to keep a tight ship.
Really interesting questions, though. Thank you.
So I would say we are a little bit over time, but let's take a break so that people can use the toilet, go and grab a coffee. Let's reconvene in 5 minutes if we can. But please, before we all break, please join me in a round of applause for Juliet.